All right, we are live on Las Vegas Triathlon Club Facebook page, and I'm recording. I'm John Mercer, president of Las Vegas Tri Club and professor at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Department of Kinesiology and Nutrition Sciences. And tonight, we've got a special video podcast where we're going to talk about cramping, and we've got a special guest. But I'm actually going to turn the mic and video over to Ted to do the introduction. Hey, Ted, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing good.
All right. Hey, it's Friday night. It's time for us to have another podcast. This is great.
Yeah.
It's officially the weekend. I clocked out just about 5:30, so I'm ready to start to think about triathlon and talk triathlon. And tonight, you're right. We have somebody really special. We have a guest, and it's not always we have guests. Originally this came up on a Facebook question, was asking about cramps and cramping in endurance sports and cramping in sports. And this is an area that I'm pretty well versed in, both as an athletic trainer and as an educator, and also as a triathlete who suffered from too many cramps and trying to figure out exactly what was causing them. And then we also have another faculty member with us, and this is Lauren. And Lauren is doing her PhD right now, and she is studying cramping. And she actually, her background is an athletic trainer. She did her undergraduate at Whitworth, right? Whitworth in Washington, and then became a certified athletic trainer, then came to UNLV for grad school and worked with UNLV athletics, and then has worked in the community as an athletic trainer. And we finally have hired her to be a faculty member while she's doing her PhD at UNLV. And so we're super excited to have her because, I dabble a little bit in the science of cramping, but she's into the nitty gritty of it. One of the things that I've had to talk to her about is we had to tone it down a little bit because when she gets into the neurophysiology of cramping, it's above I think almost everybody. So we're gonna do our best to make this very, very relevant. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to be here and talking with you guys, and by no means do I consider myself an expert on cramping yet, but it's definitely an interest. Yeah, I'm working on it.
So Lauren, in athletics forever, since we've been doing athletics and probably even before then, warring tribes and whatever, people and humans have been cramping, right? So in a nutshell, and we'll start at a very high area. What do you think? Like, why do we cramp?
Yeah, so that's a good question, but let me first start by let's just defining this specific muscle cramp that we're talking about here, because I think that can even get grouped up into this bigger category. So the type of cramps that we're talking about here are exercise associated muscle cramps. These are involuntary, painful, like spastic muscle contractions that are occurring in otherwise healthy adults, right? That don't have any underlying diseases or conditions that are causing these cramps. They're not taking medications, and they're seemingly healthy, but their muscles are cramping during or after exercise. I think it's helpful to kind of operate under that definition here. We're not talking about, night cramps or cramps associated with different conditions. We're not talking about.
There's no disease process here, right?
Exactly. Or even menstrual cramps, or even the side stitches that some people will complain about with exercise. This is where your muscle is just involuntarily spasming. It's contracting and cramping. So you asked kind of, what do you think is causing it? Is that right?
I was saying, why does it happen?
Why does it happen? Yeah.
And maybe I'll answer my own question.
Yeah.
I think it happens as a protective mechanism, right?
I think so. Yeah.
The grand scheme of things, right? It's like you're doing something that is too much to the system.
Yep.
And centrally, I'm going to stop you. My body says it's too much of something, and I'm going to stop you. Would you agree to that on a very high level?
I would. I think that when you get down to the different theories about what is contributing to a cramp, ultimately what it is it's our body's stopping us for some reason, right? It's physically stopping you, and whether that might be metabolic reasons, whether that is fatigue related, whether that is your nervous system is starting to go a little bit haywire. It's your body saying stop in some capacity, or slow down, or something's going on.
It forces you to stop, right?
It
like
literally does.
this is
It
not
will
something
stop
that,
you.
you can't run through this. You can't, as athletic trainers, how many times have we been on the sideline and somebody, they're running down the field and all of a sudden they grab their hamstring or grab their calf and they fall to the ground. It literally is stop. You do not proceed, do not pass go, right? Do not collect $200. You are incapacitated.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting, right? Because there's not too many other things physiologically that will do that to a human.
Right. Yeah. Without any sort of contact or without any
Right.
other extraneous variables coming onto it. I mean, you can look at other orthopedic injuries and that's explained by you fall down, go boom, or somebody hits you and then you go boom. Right. And this is, it's so spontaneous and it's
think about it.
unpredictable.
If we get to a point like where we're so fatigued, I can't take another step. Well, you probably can take another step, right? Or you're so hungry you can't continue. Well, you probably can continue a little bit longer.
Right.
Right. It's a tapering effect, whereas a cramp is like an instantaneous thing. And so that's why I think it's this protective mechanism that's jumping in. So when we let's go a little bit deeper into this. And you started to talk about some of the theories. So let's take it from maybe a large view of some of the bigger theories. Actually, before we do that, maybe we should explain that we don't know why cramping occurs. Right?
Yes, that's a really good point.
We have theories that are, there's ongoing research to try and figure it out. And there are definitely different camps in research as far as we think this is the reason, we think this is the reason, we think this is the reason. But ultimately, at this point, as scientists, we do not know why. So let's talk about some of the major theories. You want to go ahead and you can start with that.
Definitely. Yeah. So that's a really good point. I think the one key phrase to classify cramps as is that they are multifactorial, right? There's not one cause.
What does that mean? Yeah. It means that there's not one cause. And I think that's why we don't know, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, it could be, there's 12 factors and you've reached the pinnacle, or you reached this happening because 7 out of those 12 things happened.
Right. It's kind of like a threshold, right? And I think that that's important for us to look at cramping, is that there's a lot of factors that go into why your muscle contracts or why it can involuntarily contract like this. And that if you start to add some of these factors in, we don't really know the weight of each factor, but that there's multiple mechanisms that might be at play to get you to the point where you've reached that threshold and now you cramp. And so I think that's a really important thing for us to like you said, to start off with understanding, is that there's not a one size fits all approach. Yeah. Now, I will say that majority of cramp research has kind of fallen into one of two main theories, okay? That we know that these are prevalent factors, and so there's some argument back and forth between them. And I don't think that these are mutually exclusive theories. I'll start by saying that. It's not that you can only have one or the other. A lot of times there's crossover happening between those. But so basically it falls, the science falls into one of two camps. Either the big prevalent theory kind of in history has been the dehydration and electrolyte loss theory, which basically states that as you're exercising, your body is undergoing dehydration, right? It's losing fluids. And as we sweat, we lose not just fluids, but we also lose electrolytes in that sweat. And so as we start to dehydrate, basically what it's saying is that is a mechanism for us to cramp muscles. To get into the science just a little bit, what it's saying is that basically as we start to dehydrate, it's got to pull fluid from somewhere for us to kind of thermoregulate and control our body temperature and to sweat out fluids. And so some of that fluid comes from interstitial spaces. This is the space between cells, right? And it's in these interstitial spaces that we have fluid, and we have metabolites, and we've got these different things that go and feed cells to make cells function. Not every cell has a blood supply right indirectly to it. And so when we start to dehydrate, this theory states that the interstitial spaces start to kind of contract, right? They kind of shrink up and shrivel up like a raisin that's dehydrated. And so when they say that this happens, they say that it causes mechanical pressure on some of our neuromuscular junctions or on nerve terminals, and that makes it easier for those to fire. So when we think about a muscle spasm or a muscle cramp, it's that our muscle is firing involuntarily and kind of uncontrollably. So that's kind of where that theory emerged. And it's kind of funny because they've used that historically. They've seen it in heat, in hot working conditions where people are exercising a lot. So there's a lot of just kind of history that's got us to that point. But I would say the more newer, recent theory that has stronger.
Let's talk about that theory first.
Sure, let's do it.
That's the theory, and we're kind of here to kind of a little bit debunk some theories.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So my question for you is, and this is no pun intended, is why does that theory not hold water?
That's a great way to put it too, pun intended there. So the reason why this theory, I guess, really doesn't hold a lot of water is because it's not the case every single time, and we have some interventions that historically have worked in the past that don't address this as a cause, right? So let me back up and say, that like I said, the history of this has been on old research that has looked at workers out at Hoover Dam, actually, and in hot working conditions, just like laboring all day, and that were developing cramps. And so they started to look at sweat rates, right? Then some other, in like kind of more, I would say more 1990s, there was a lot more research that was happening on athletes and athletes working out and cramping. And so there was a couple of really small studies that looked at some tennis players, actually, that had a history of cramping, and they tracked sweat rates. And they saw that, yeah, people are crampers, or those who have a history of cramping, are sweating more, and they're sweating more electrolytes or sodium out. And so, they started to go down this path based on some smaller size studies. There's Gatorade actually funded a few studies about this in particular. So kind of just a little bit of a, possible bias, maybe not, but a fluid replacement company did a couple of studies in professional sports, and also saw that, yeah, these people who cramp, who say they're cramping, they are losing more sweat, and they are losing more sodium in their sweat. So this has got to be why they're cramping. It's kind of funny because when you put all of those studies together, there's only actually about 29 total participants that this theory is based on. And from these studies, not one of them actually cramped when they did this exercise. So it's just kind of interesting that that's how we've kind of generalized this theory, and so a lot of research recently has started to kind of debunk some of this myth, and
let me ask you this. So yeah. As we're talking about that, because I've read all this same research, and you're exactly right? So we always have to look at bias in research. So that being said, if I'm a more acclimatized athlete, do I sweat more or sweat less?
So you might be able to answer this a little bit better, but I'll just start by saying sweat rates are completely variable. Right. I believe that most are going to sweat more. Is that correct?
Yeah. So even and we'll completely agree they're variable, right? We can look at it. There's been lots of research even in the triathlon world, people having sweat rates of like 1 liter per hour to 3 liters per hour, and even more than that. But we do also see that as people become more acclimatized to the heat, they sweat more regardless. Mm-hmm. So that person that was a 1 liter, if they become acclimatized to heat, they may actually go up to 1.5 liters, up to 2 liters. So it's interesting, right? Like the more acclimatized you become, the more you sweat. And we also see the fitter you are in general, the more you sweat. Yeah. Right? So it's interesting, right? Like we're thinking about, the people that sweat more, they're going to cramp more. But the people that sweat more also tend to be the more fit people and the more acclimatized people, which kind of goes exactly against this theory, right?
Exactly. And let me follow up by saying that, once some other researchers really started to kind of do a little bit more quality research, you know, and looking at larger sample sizes among many different sports. There was 11 different sports. There was multiple colleges, and there was over 350 athletes for this one study that they looked at. And they found that there was no differences in sweat rate and sodium sweat concentration that between crampers and non-crampers. So that's really big. Like once we actually kind of look at the research a little bit more, it shows like, hey, this really isn't a huge factor to help us identify who's going to cramp and who's not.
There was one group that was an exception in that research though, right?
There was, yes, out of all of the sports. So this was about looking at sweat rates as a predictor of who's going to cramp. And so with that being said, out of those 11 sports, the only one predictive association they found that sweat rates will help me to determine who's going to cramp is with American football. And so we don't really know why yet, but they had an association between, okay, if you sweat more, then you're probably more likely to cramp, but that's it.
And I would say that, you know, as far as like our audience, that's pretty far from the triathlon audience, right?
Completely. That's a whole different ball game, literally.
So I'm going to share with the group, and just so you know, this is Lauren's first time on our podcast, but I'm going to share with you my typical cramping story. And
please.
Why this also doesn't hold water. So I typically cramp I'm going to say 90% of my races. Okay. I typically never cramp in training. So that's one reason. As I can ride my bike. I can go for like a 6 or 7 hour bike ride in the heat. No cramping. I can go into a race, and the typical time for me to cramp is about 10 minutes into the swim, which is 10 minutes into the race. And then I cramp again in T1. So as we move from a bike to, from the swim to the bike. So I can tell you one thing, I'm definitely not dehydrated and I'm not electrolyte depleted after 10 minutes.
You're exactly right.
And so right there, at least for me, I know that dehydration and electrolyte, well, maybe electrolyte depletion is not the issue. Now, I could have an electrolyte imbalance. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I have a potassium, sodium, calcium, magnesium imbalance that I'm not aware of. But I'm definitely not dehydrated at that point, right? I'm actually primed up to race. I've actually even cramped in a warm up for a race.
Yeah.
But other than the odd time swimming where I'll get like a crazy little toe cramp, I don't cramp training ever. And then I'll take this back to even my days as an athletic trainer, and you can speak to this as well. When you are working with athletes, do they cramp more in games or in practice?
I would say historically, they are primarily only cramping in games or competitive settings and not in training. And there's a couple different factors that might kind of explain that, but it's always games.
And as an athletic trainer, I would say that athletes are hyper vigilant about hydration for games way more than practice.
Yes.
As an athletic trainer, I would oftentimes see guys come to practice or girls come to practice, they're dehydrated to begin with. But for a game, never, right? It's like, oh, I got to make sure I'm all primed up. So this is another, these are anecdotes, but what I'm seeing, and I saw clinically, and I think what you saw clinically was that same thing. So that also kind of debunks this dehydration myth.
Go ahead, John.
I was going to jump in. I just wanted to follow up with your story. You're talking about the cramps that you see during triathlons. Has anyone documented when triathletes cramp, whether it's swim, bike, or run? Because anecdotally, I would say it's the swim and the run and not so much on the bike.
Not so much on the bike. Although I have cramped on the bike once. I actually had an adductor cramp. Oof. So, the hip adductor cramp, it was horrible. But honestly, John, I have not seen any research on that. But man, that'd be a good research study, wouldn't it?
I'll tell you this much. So there's some really prominent researchers out of South Africa. Dr. Schwellnus has done a lot of research on triathletes or ultramarathoners or different endurance races. And so from the research that he's done, I don't believe they've ever looked at the exact the mode of exercise during these events, but they usually will kind of track the time. And unlike you, Ted, most are cramping either during the middle to end. So I guess that kind of lends some support.
On the run. Now, don't get me
Yeah.
wrong.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Like, I'll cramp again about halfway through the run. So it's not, but what I'm saying is, so at that point, yeah, I'm probably dehydrated and we'll probably have some electrolyte imbalances. But what I'm saying is it's not mutually exclusive.
Right, right. And there's maybe other mechanisms that might be at play to explain why you're re-cramping later. So I can talk about that later. But one thing I do want to point out though is consider what is the most notorious treatment of an acute muscle cramp. What are we all told? What are we all told to do? When you cramp a muscle,
Stretch.
You stretch it. So let me ask you this. So this has been an intervention that has been used historically, right? And it's been successful. It really has. You know, most people find success stretching their cramps. Does stretching add fluid to your body? Nope. Does stretching change your electrolyte levels?
Nope.
Nope. So that's kind of another kind of debunker here, is that we use interventions that don't support the theory, and the interventions kind of work.
Yeah.
You know, I'd also suggest that, you know, when people say that, okay, if it is dehydration and fluid loss and electrolyte loss, you know, considering that as a treatment of fluid replacement during a race or during a competition, the problem is that takes time. Right? It actually takes time. If I'm orally ingesting some sort of substance for it to go through the digestive tract and you know, be broken down and then emptied from the stomach and then gone and absorbed into the bloodstream, right? So it takes time. So this isn't really, fluid replacement isn't an effective treatment of a cramp when you're having it right then and there.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the next theory.
Yeah, definitely. So this one's I would say a little bit newer of a theory, and based on the research, it has stronger evidence and a little bit more support. Once again, it's not one size fits all, and it's not mutually exclusive here. But the other theory is that there is some sort of neuromuscular fatigue that is occurring. And usually this is related to our central nervous system. So central is our brain and our spinal cord, versus peripheral is all the nerves that go in and wire our muscles, right? And our organs and things like that. But so if our central nervous system is starting to undergo fatigue, right? As I'm exercising, somehow fatigue is causing these changes in electrical signals, right? And so when we think about signals being sent to our body, this is what's called an afferent signal. And even with just the signals that are dictating what our muscle does, we have these signals that kind of respond to, you know, the change in length of our muscle. And then we have signals that respond to the change in tension of our muscle. And these will all interact with the central nervous system to essentially tell a muscle either when to contract and fire or when to relax or be inhibited. And so this neuromuscular fatigue theory states that as we are fatiguing, as we continue with exercise, that basically we have this teeter-tottering or this imbalance of the signals that say yes, fire, and these excitatory signals, those start to happen way more often. These are more frequent. It's more easy to excite muscles. And then we have this imbalance of the signals that tell our muscles to relax, to inhibit, to not contract. Those actually start to diminish. So we have this imbalance of fire, contract happening way more than relax happening. And so that's kind of a perfect storm for a muscle cramp to occur, right? It's this involuntary signal where I'm just getting this overload of excitatory signals to that motor neuron and not enough relax signals to it. And so that causes a muscle cramp potentially.
Okay, so I like this theory, but can we debunk it?
Yes, we can. We can. One of the biggest ways to debunk it is by saying, hey, whenever you fatigue, are you cramping every time?
Exactly.
Nope, you're not. And so this definitely has some...
You can push yourself to the absolute limit, right? Or you cannot take another step. You collapse. We've seen this in triathlon. We've seen people collapse. They don't cramp.
Right.
Sometimes they do, right? But not always. So, that's another, I guess another quiver in our arrow here, as far as, the multifactorial piece of this. So right. I actually think that even as we can debunk it with that, it might be a piece of it.
Right. I think it's important to think about that. Like fatigue is that in and of itself is such a big topic. And there's a lot of ways that our system can fatigue, right? There's a lot of contributing factors to fatigue. It could be metabolic, like what am I putting into my body, right? Am I fueling well? Am I hydrating well? That could induce fatigue. So that's kind of how we can have some crossover maybe. Or maybe it's that, has anybody been tired from just being stressed? Right? Yeah. Maybe there's a psychological component. Maybe, if you didn't get enough sleep before that race, that might induce fatigue faster. Maybe it's related to a genetic predisposition.
I call it the stress bucket, right?
Okay, yeah.
So you have the way I look at it is maybe even a cup, like a stress cup. So you have a cup that you can basically, your body can handle this amount of stress. And we as athletes often think of that cup as only physical.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
It's not taking into account all the other stresses. So, I'm going to throw out a few more stresses that, go into triathlon racing. Okay. So number one stress you mentioned is not sleeping well, right? I am notorious for not sleeping well the day before, especially a big race. The bigger the race and the more I've set myself up that I'm going to do well tomorrow and it means something to me, the less I sleep. A couple of my best races, I literally did not sleep 1 minute the night before.
Oh gosh. Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster right there.
I'm physically primed and I'm like a caged animal, just cannot wait to get to that start line. And that's a problem, right? Then if we look at some of the other stresses that we deal with. So travel. Right, travel to a race. John can speak very specifically to the stresses of travel, like your bike not getting there, your bags getting lost.
How about as simple as jet lag, right? Or different time zones.
Different time zones. So then we have the circadian stresses, not sleeping in your own environment. We know for a fact, this is research on it. The first 2 nights in a hotel or a strange place, you do not sleep as deep, and it is what it is. So those are the pieces that go into the stress bucket. You may not be eating the same because you're changing. Oh man, I got to race, so I'm going to eat very specific these few days. That can add to your stress bucket. Maybe work was tough that week, and it's like, man, I got to get all this done because I got to travel on Friday, so I'm taking the day off. I got to get all my work done before Friday. Because I know I gotta travel I gotta drive down to California for a race. The drive, right? There's all of these pieces that build into this stress bucket. And so you have the physical stress and then you have all the other stresses. And once you get to a certain threshold, what you mentioned, right? That's when I think cramping occurs. At least that's kind of how I think about it. And that takes some of this theory and makes it work, because it's not just the physical, right? Because you can go to physical exhaustion if you don't have all those other things that build up to your stress cup or stress bucket. What do you think about that?
I honestly would 100% agree with you. And actually, this is kind of an area that I'm trying to pursue with my own research, is that we know it doesn't fit cleanly into one of 2 of these categories. And maybe there's some mix over, but there is a lot in this fatigue a theory that there's confounding variables. There's other factors that affect how quickly you fatigue and how poorly that performance can go down, and so I would completely agree. I'm going to be hopefully looking at sleep and psychological stress variables myself, and I would even argue that pain, or the perception of pain, or the anxiety that you're going to be in pain, that also has been shown to cause cramping. Like, there's been some pretty cool research in the area of pain, that when we inject like a pain causing agent into muscles, it actually can cause a muscle cramp. Or, when with just the anxiety of going through maybe some sort of cognitive stress or psychological stress, literally causes our muscles to become tenser, right? We have EMG responses that show that there's more muscle activity going on when we're psychologically stressed. And so I completely agree that there's other factors that might be more within our control, right? You know, it's not so, I mean, obviously for those in triathletes or triathlons, there's a lot of factors that you try to control to make it as perfect of a race, right? And as performance as you can make it. And I would argue that some of those are more important, like getting enough sleep, you know, trying to find a way to relieve that stress or that anxiety, and making sure that you're paying attention to fueling and things like that, you know, but just getting your mind right for that race, I think can really be powerful in that.
Yeah, you know, so some of the little tactics that I do now, like the night before a race, I try and kind of switch everything off around like 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
I have a bath with lavender salts, lavender Epsom salts. I got some nice gentle music going. I got my blue blocker glasses on. I got some candlelight. It's like very romantic, especially when I'm traveling by myself. And
treat yourself, right? Treat yourself.
And you know, I don't have the TV on. I don't have anything else. Just try and mitigate out all the stress I can. I try and do a massage the day before, but like a very specific, like not a one that was going to cause me any soreness, right? I'll go to a massage and say, hey, I want a very light massage, and really just everything I can do to relax. And I think a lot of times, and you may not be aware of this, but the day before a big triathlon is very stressful. You've got to set your bike up. You got to get your shoes at this place. You got to make sure you maybe if you travel, you have to put your bike together. You're worrying about tire pressure. You're worrying about what the transition looks like and where am I going to run from? Where am I going to go to? And all these little things. It's interesting. The day before a race, I used to always be like, oh, I'm going to have time to do this, do this, do this, do this. No, you're not. You know. So I now put time in for relaxation the day before, and I really try my very best to do that. And as I'm getting better at this, now we're not racing, so we'll see when the racing starts again. But I think I'm getting better at that, and so those are just some suggestions I think that we can ultimately give out to people. Okay, so let's move on to the next.
Let me jump in because I love this discussion, and I think this is really good practical advice for triathletes. So
yep.
I also buy into this. I'm not a cramp expert. This is my area of research, but I think looking at the stress and the stress bucket has some real validity. And, you know, anecdotally, this happens to me. If my stress gets too high, then my rheumatoid arthritis will kick in and I get a calf cramp. And I'm just getting over it now. And once you get it, it's so hard to get rid of. But I know it's stress related and not physical stress, although that's part of it.
Yeah, it's into the stress bucket.
And now you've got to figure out how to get rid of it. But I'm wondering, Lauren, you talked about this being multifactorial. Is part of our problem that we're lumping all cramps together? Is this like one type of cramp and then another type of cramp would be from another mechanism and they're not necessarily related to each other?
So that's a really good point. And I would say, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of variability even within the same person as to why they cramped, right? Like not only is it multifactorial, but we don't really, research hasn't been able to identify the weight of certain factors, right? Like what's the main thing that puts you over, right? That empties that, or, you know, that kind of overflows that stress bucket. We haven't really been able to identify that. And then, like you said, even just from one race to another or one cramp to another, it might be different, you know. And I will say this, that it's kind of tough too, once you've cramped one time during some sort of race or competition. You know, there's been some really cool research that actually had people that voluntarily cramped themselves, like they could squeeze their muscles until it started to cramp, and then they tracked kind of the sensitivity or how easily it was to now re-cramp them later on, and they found out that the system's just more excitable afterwards too. So like Ted, what you were talking about, how, you know, you cramp in the first 10 minutes and then the transition and then the run potentially, that is most likely just a mechanism of the system's already so hyper excitable at this point that sometimes even our acute immediate treatments, it's not going to tide you over. It's not that you're not going to cramp anymore for that day. It's a difficult thing, you know. It's hard to not be able to say this is why you cramped and this is why you cramp every time. You know, the research just isn't there yet. And so I think that a real practical suggestion for those people who are cramping and they don't know why, right? Maybe one day they're like, I ate really well and I drank really well for that race and I slept really well, or I've been training really hard at this intensity. I think that it's important to for those who cramp, right? Who are crampers. If you're a cramper, you know it, right? To do a cramp journal, right? Yeah. So you identify, okay, when did I cramp? Kind of time of day, right? What was the activity, kind of the intensity of that activity? You know, how did you sleep last night? How many hours did you get? When and how often are you eating and drinking, and how much are you, eating and drinking fluids, and, what was your perceived like psychological state, if we start to kind of gather all of these different variables and actually document it for those known crampers and kind of write it down, we will be able to see trends much easier, right? We can kind of start to see patterns that, maybe I tracked my sweat rate, right? And I'm noticing that maybe that is contributing in my case. Maybe it wasn't in this case, but maybe we can start to see some patterns here. It requires you to be kind of proactive about it, it's hard because cramping doesn't kill people, right? Cramping is very transient. It's kind of one of those things that people try to not make a big deal out of. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people don't even want to seek medical attention like after they've cramped. And maybe that might be something to start tracking, is if this is really happening to you often, let's see if there's any patterns. And then that can help us to identify the correct treatment maybe for you, or maybe not treatment, but prevention for you. What can we start to address to try to prevent those cramps from occurring?
That is an awesome idea. In fact, I just got my log out because I have not logged this last cramp. And what you just said is how I was able to sort of deduce what was going on with this. So I think that's a great suggestion. So nice point.
I can't take credit for that, but
a cramp log is a great idea. Let me throw out another kind of thing that I think is it's a stress bucket thing, and maybe even a little bit different theory. And this goes back to why people cramp in events more than in practice. I think one of the other things that ultimately happens is people become people out race or outplay their training, right? So people do try harder in a race. They do try harder in an event. I'm notorious for this, is that I don't like to run fast, and we've talked about this on other podcasts when I train, but when I race, I run fast. And so I think sometimes when I cramp running, it's because, I have not spent much time at that pace. But my fitness is good enough to do it, especially because I've built so much fitness over years, and especially many hours on the bike. And my muscles, they're not ready for that stress of running 13 miles at the pace I can cardiovascularly do it. So I think that's a piece of it. And I remember back when I was an athletic trainer working at a high school, and I had a few athletes, they always cramped like every game. And I can still remember there was these two kids, and they didn't really practice that hard. But man, game time, and they were some of the best players on the team. So they're playing both sides on the football team. And they're, before the game, slapping each other in the head and getting all amped up, and, having the Red Bulls before they went out, and just, and the fans are screaming for them, and they invariably cramp every single game. Right. And at that point, I didn't know as much about cramping as before, but I do think, and we've talked about this before, you are who you are, and you are what you've trained. And sometimes in sporting events, especially sporting events, I think we sometimes push a little bit beyond where our abilities are. And I think that adds, once again, to the stress bucket, but also is another piece of the puzzle. So Lauren, let me ask you another question then. So do we have any other theories?
So there's actually some pretty cool things that it's kind of like voodoo magic a little bit out there. But there's
theories of why we cramp.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to kind of go down a treatment route here.
Do we have any other theories as far as why we cramp, or are we kind of covered?
Those are really the two big groups, you know,
Okay.
and like I said, I think that there's starting to become more and more research out there that's saying like there's underlying variables even within both of those camps.
Yeah.
You know, so that's kind of my understanding is it's really theory wise, it's kind of broken down into those physiological theories, but recognizing that there's other factors that kind of can contribute to that.
Okay, so before we go into the voodoo magic of how we treat these things and how we can prevent them, let's talk really briefly about that cramp journal again, and
Yeah.
some of the maybe the things we should track. So you mentioned sleep, right? You mentioned what we eat. You mentioned what we drink. You mentioned what else did you mention? Our overall stress level.
Yep.
Maybe our psychological stress and our physical stress. Maybe we could.
Yeah, maybe like intensity of the exercise or what you're doing, if you can kind of gauge that perceived intensity there.
The other thing I like to look at is the intensity of exercise going into it, right? So, you know, most of the triathletes keep pretty good logs of their training. You know, we could look at our taper, you know, how did we taper this time versus the time we didn't cramp? And, you know, or what was our maximum fitness level as we came into our taper? And I know some people they don't like to taper and they don't like to kind of bring that stress level down, the physical stress level down. So I think those are all things that we could put into that journal. Can you think of anything else?
Yeah, so I think, you know, if you feel that the dehydration part may be a component, you know, then I would say that during some of those activities, you measure your sweat rate. And there's actually a very simple way of doing this. Is all you have to do is just during some sort of exercise that you don't do this during a competition, but you want to measure yourself before exercise. And then as long as during that exercise, you're not, you know, going and relieving yourself, you're not intaking more fluids or eating anything. If you just exercise, then afterwards you can weigh yourself. And so theoretically, any weight that's been lost would be due to fluid loss. And so while it's not, you know, in research, it hasn't been shown to be a huge predictor, for some cases, it can be a factor, right? And so maybe that can help you to determine if fluid replacement or better hydration strategies might be a factor in your case or might be a good way to prevent those. But, you know, it's one of those things that you don't want to just blanket say you're not drinking enough, you know? I mean, maybe in triathlete settings, that is a very real, you know, possibility here that you're just not getting to put in enough that your body is taking out here. But in a lot of other physical activity or exercise environments, you know, people aren't dying from dehydration, but we just feel like we just constantly have to pour water and fluids and sports drinks down our throats. And the reality is that that's just bad advice. It's kind of misguided advice. You want to drink to thirst. You don't want to over drink, okay? Because while dehydration doesn't really kill anybody, you know, it really doesn't, overhydration can. So there's just something to maybe consider as a factor for
nobody in a triathlon that I've ever heard of has died from dehydration.
Nope. Dehydration deaths are when you cannot get to water, when you physically are like stranded on a desert island, right? Like there's no water to drink. Dehydration is not a factor in athletics or in physical activity where it's causing death, right? It decreases performance. Yeah, you know, we definitely see you know, plenty of research on that.
You can cause some organ damage, and you could. You know,
I
really,
guess
you'll probably stop before
Exactly.
before that occurs, and you'll find water.
And it's got to be big weight losses. And
Yes.
so I'm really glad to hear this. This is really good. Now we got to watch our time. So
Let me just add. Go ahead, John. We'll add one more thing, and then we'll talk about some of these voodoo treatments. And not even voodoo, some things really do actually work. And that is that. And I don't know how many people know this, but like elite marathoners in particular plan weight loss during their race. Yeah. So they actually are planning to lose about 6, up to 8% of body weight during the race. And it's actually built into their training. And so they're going to, you know, they know that they're going to be lighter at the finish. And so as they become more fatigued, they're actually going to be basically lighter. And you can look at some of the really elite marathoners are doing this. and they're actually training like this, and they're using it as a training stimuli of actually being dehydrated as an actual training stimuli. But that's a whole nother talk. So let's talk about what we can do. Number one, do you want to talk about treat on this case? Because I think we really, as far as prevention, I think we talked a little bit. I think we talked enough about that. So what can we do to treat voodoo treating?
Yeah, so I think the one of the things obviously that has kind of stood the test of time is that stretching is a really quick treatment, right? That when I stretch that muscle, the muscle literally can't continue to contract anymore and shorten anymore. So that's one thing out there. I'm also kind of looking into some other manual techniques like not actually stretching a muscle, but rather shortening it more. And there's some physiological mechanisms behind when I just tell my system to relax and I actually shorten that muscle more, it can send some signals that might potentially cause a reduction in the excitatory signals. So I'm going to look into that a little bit, but there's some kind of voodoo magic stuff out there that actually might have a place. So one of the things that a lot of people have done before in the past is maybe people are familiar with pickle juice, mustard, right? People have used bananas. I will say that using bananas really doesn't have, that's one of those things where when you ingest that, it's got to take time to digest. You're not going to get this absorption of nutrients and electrolytes back to treat a cramp. Mustard, people are literally just chugging mustard packets on sidelines and during a race, and pickle juice is the big one here, where they actually there's been some studies that have shown that drinking small amounts of pickle juice, like about 70 milliliters, it's like a shot of pickle juice, that has the ability to reduce cramp duration, actually. I mean, and it still takes some time. Most of the cramps that they use this for still were lasting about a minute and a half, like 90 seconds.
Like 60 to 90 minutes.
Seconds. Yeah. Oh gosh, can you imagine minutes? But so that it was able to reduce cramp duration more than drinking water or doing nothing. And so when we think about that, like, it's like, okay, why do we get these findings? I don't know, right? Like realistically, it's not happening from digestion. It's not being addressed that these nutrients are coming in and being absorbed through my bloodstream that quickly. It's just not happening. It's sitting in the stomach.
We're looking at 15 minutes. Right.
Oh, best case, right? Yeah. But drinking a small amount of any sort of substance, that's not going to empty your stomach fast enough. Usually
how does it stop the cramp in 90 seconds?
Exactly, right? But so when we think about faster mechanisms, that kind of goes to the nervous system. And so what some researchers are starting to identify is that there's the pickle juice and the acetic acid and the vinegar inside of it. This acidity, once it hits the back of the throat, it actually triggers a neurological reflex. And there's these receptors in the back of our throat here that can somehow make it so that those excitatory signals are diminished and that we can cause this relaxation of a cramping muscle. And we don't really know the exact mechanisms behind why yet, but we know that it's not happening because you're ingesting it and it's digesting. It's not that route. So there's more research that needs to happen in this area. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of a hot shot. There hasn't been a lot of published research on that particular product, but they say that it's kind of aimed at a similar mechanism, that instead of being digested, it's triggering a reflex that's causing the central nervous system to kind of calm down a little bit. So there might be some cause for using that.
For a practical application, I can tell you that if you were to do a search of my house right now, you would find hot shots.
Yeah.
You'd probably find at least 30 of them. I was sponsored by them for a little while in 2017, and happened to keep them. And you would also find probably at least 90 bottles of pickle juice.
Yeah. Yes. Some stuff. We don't know how, but some.
And I'll tell you, once again, as a practical application, once you've been a cramper, you can actually many times tell when it's going to happen. Like I can tell, especially when I'm running, that if I keep at this pace, maybe 10 or 15 more steps, I might just cramp. So the natural thing is to slow down, right? So if I slow down, it's not going to happen, but I want to keep going at that pace. So what I do, I slow down, I drink, I don't actually do 70 milliliters. I do sips of it. So maybe 10 or 15 milliliters, 10 or 15 milliliters, and just kind of let it sit in your mouth. Like, don't actively do it, drink it. And then once again, practical. Don't do it and then hit a water station and slug a bunch of water, because that'll clear it through the throat. And you don't want that. You want to sit in your throat.
Right.
And I can tell you this, in my experience, about 75% of the time, it works. And I used to use pickle juice, and then I went to Hot Shot. Hot Shots I'm not gonna lie, it's rough. It tastes like a mix of cayenne pepper and vinegar and mustard, and it's just not a pleasant. It's not a pleasant thing. But now I use one before I swim, like before in a big race, before I get in the water, I do that, and then I have two sitting in my shoes in T2. And so then I grab them, and it's in a long race, and I put them in my jersey. I got little pockets for them, got them just on the go. And so, 2-3 miles down the road, I can start to feel a cramp maybe coming on, take just a little sip, and constantly little sips, maybe for it might take a mile to get through the whole bottle, and then I'm good. And then maybe at mile 10, it'll happen again. Oh, open up the second one. And for me, it may be voodoo, but I'm telling you, I've had very good success with these things. And the research, like you said, it's getting stronger in this area. And some of the main researchers in this area, the one guy is actually a Nobel laureate, I think, right, or Nobel Prize winner, that actually developed Hot Shot.
Gotcha.
A neurophysiologist. And this is not just complete out of nowhere. There's another company that I wanted to mention, and I don't have any affiliation with them at all, and it's called Cramping.
Yeah, I've heard of that, but I haven't looked into it.
This is a newer one, and it's actually kind of mega doses of potassium, and they're seeing, and I don't know, and it's supposed it kind of tastes, I guess, like seawater.
Oh, interesting.
And they're doing acute cramps, 4,000 milligrams of potassium in a drink. And they're seeing in some of their white papers, it's a pretty small company. They're seeing cramps being relieved in 90 seconds.
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't, and here's kind of how clinical practice and how medicine works, right? Is we see this phenomenon and we say why and how, and even though the science can't really catch up yet, it doesn't mean that this might not work for somebody, but I would say that I would question, or just at least if there's crampers out there who are oh, okay, I just need to go drink a ton of pickle juice now and that'll solve all my problems. Maybe check with your doctor first, right? But maybe see if that is something that could potentially help here.
Since this is a podcast and we're not, we don't have any masters here, I will tell you, do not check with your doctor first.
That's fair.
No, I'm telling you, because your doctors aren't going to be able to answer this, right? Honestly, the people that know the most about this, go see an athletic trainer.
Yeah.
Right? Your general physician, you come in and you say, oh, I cramp when I'm doing a triathlon. Oh, well, probably don't do triathlons.
Yeah, that'll solve your problems.
It will solve your problem. I'm here to solve your problems. And I'm just telling you that, there are reasons to not do things, and particularly that potassium issue. Yeah, maybe that one, you want to look at your kidney function, and you want to look at if you have any heart arrhythmias. Yeah,
just to make sure that ingesting some of these substances on a regular basis but
I'm just telling you, as far as for the most part, your physician's not going to have any clue what to do. So I'm just.
That's a very good point.
So, John, go ahead.
I was going to say, I love the advice. Go see an athletic trainer. I think that's fantastic, because athletic trainers are in the front line of a lot of this. So yeah. That's great. But what kind of pickle juice? I mean,
should I go grab a bottle?
Yeah, exactly.
I have not tried the pickle juice, so.
Really, any pickle juice will work. I know some athletic trainers who will go and like they've got little deals with like Firehouse Subs, and they'll be like, hey, let me just take your buckets of pickle juice that you're not going to do anything with, right? You take the pickles out and you just got the juice left, and let me use it.
It can't be the sweet one. It's got to be
That's
like
fair, yes.
dill pickle. So this is the company.
Yeah. Okay. There.
It's actually.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, okay. So you're actually buying a thing of pickle juice, not
Yep. And
a pickle
it's
jar.
probably 70 milliliters.
You probably could get
milliliters,
away.
Extra strength pickle juice shot.
You could probably get away with getting some just run-of-the-mill dill pickle juice, though, as well.
I love the fact I got this small little container. I can hold it in my hand. And I'm telling you, this is a COVID thing. Many people don't even know this, but it's really hard to find small plastic containers these days. They're really expensive.
Oh.
And so I like these because, once again, I can hold it in my hand. And the Hot Shot is about the same size.
Oh, I've got it. Buy one and then go and buy some pickle jars and then pour into it beforehand, right?
and these are, honestly, they're not that expensive. They're, I think, about on Amazon, maybe a couple bucks or $1.50 or whatever. Once again, as an athletic trainer, sometimes I get good deals, and I think I got like 96 bottles for like $50 or something like that. So that was me.
It could be something.
Should we do a whole separate series or a whole separate show on these different treatments, I guess it would be? Or
yeah, maybe we could we absolutely could, for sure. Maybe what we should do is bring these out to one of our races and have people taste them and realize which ones they can actually get down.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like I said, there's a lot of these different things out there that people have tried. Some people say, oh yeah, I swear by this. Others will swear by that, and there's a lot of good anecdotal evidence for things, but science hasn't kept up as much with treatment because we still need to figure out the why, and the how is this happening. And so it's definitely a slow route on that side of things.
Yeah. And Lauren already mentioned it, but let's say you don't have pickle juice, or even if you do, and you get into a situation where you're on the side of the road because you've cramped and you can't walk anymore. Number one thing to do is stretch that muscle and stretch it aggressively. That is, there is actually good research behind that. If you have, that's just what you should do. And chances are it'll alleviate itself within a minute and a half, and you'll be back running again, but it will cramp again. Because once again, as Lauren was saying, you become hyper excitable after a cramp. Yeah. So unless your finish of the race is pretty soon, you're going to have to change something. One of the things, only real thing you can change at this point is intensity.
Slow down. Yeah, slow down. Yep. Definitely. And one thing I would say as well is just the power of our psychology, man, that really does a lot. And so, I completely understand that when you are actively cramping, you're freaking out, right? It hurts. It really hurts. And it's anxiety inducing and you can't get this sucker to stop, right? But consider the power of your mind, right? And how our anxiety and our stress then can potentially keep it cramping, right? There's not a lot of research that can really say that for sure, but it's one of those factors that we just kind of intuitively know. If I can calm here, I can calm here, right? If I can calm my brain down, I can calm my system down. We've seen this with the power of how we can adjust our heart rate, by just taking some deep breaths and relaxing and breathing deeper, breathing slower. We can actually cause changes within our neurological and neuromuscular systems as well. So if you're actively cramping, calm down, right? Take yourself kind of out of harm's way. Try to stretch if you can, right? I'm going to try to look into some other maybe treatment options for us here to try out, but just do your best to calm your system, place that on a stretch and get it to stop. And then from there, like Ted said, adjust your intensity and get through the workout as best as you can from there.
Awesome. John, did we get any questions from Facebook as we're going?
Actually, we've got a lot of great comments.
Okay.
We're gonna have to come back and visit this again, but lots of stories of using pickle juice some different ideas on cramping and the central governor model type of idea that you're talking about. So this is and some other people, appreciating sharing the stories of cramping happening during racing, but not during training. And so sometimes it's good to let people know they're not alone. None of us are in these things. So
yeah, I would say, I'm just anecdotally on people I've talked to, and if you think about it in a triathlon race, especially when you start talking about the longer races, you're looking at 30% of people probably have had a cramp at one point or another. We're talking about like a half Ironman or above, or even Olympic distance above. We don't see it as much in the sprint racing, but it's a real thing. And I think Lauren made mention of the anxiety, and part of it is the fear of the cramp. Like that's an anxiety in itself. Like, I know like when I'm walking down to the water to go to I'm like, oh man, it's the day. I'm going to cramp up in the first 10 minutes of my swim. And there's an anxiety there. And I've got to, like she was mentioning, like doing breathing activities and really trying to relax myself as I'm trying to prepare to race. Right. I think that sometimes we're this belief in our culture that you got to get amped up to race. No, you don't need to, because guess what? As soon as the gun goes off, you're ready. Like warm up, but don't necessarily amp yourself up. Like don't slap yourself in the face. And I think that those things will potentially induce cramps. All right. Well, John, we are up against an hour. That was an awesome talk. Lauren, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, you guys. I could talk about this for hours. So yeah, I'm happy to
bring you back. For sure, we're going to bring you back when you're done with your PhD, and we'll talk about what you found out. And then, obviously as the knowledge in the space continues to move forward, we're going to continue to move forward with it, because obviously this is an area that I'm really interested in, you're interested in, and honestly, most athletic trainers are interested in, because this is something that we see on a regular basis.
Right. That's the one thing that as I've been doing this research, that people can relate to this. They can relate to the pain of a cramp, and even if it's not killing them or it's not causing significant issues within their life, it's interesting, and let's get to the bottom of it. Yeah.
Awesome.
This is great. Thanks so much, Lauren. This is
of course. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, you guys. I've had a good time. So.
All right. Well, we're back every Friday night.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everybody for listening and watching.
John, before we leave, let's make a quick shout out for next week on the podcast. We've got Nicole Kiley. She's coming back for number 2. She is the sport dietitian. And so we're really looking forward to having her speak next week. And we're going to be talking about supplements and common supplements in the endurance world. So if you have questions about supplements, you want to throw them in the Facebook page beforehand, that would be great.
Awesome. Pickle juice supplements.
Pickle juice supplements, exactly.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, everybody.